Today I'll be going over my process for scanning negatives with my Epson V550 flatbed scanner. I've spent weeks doing test scans trying to figure out exactly what each setting in epsonscan does, so you don't have to. And I believe I have a pretty good method worked out for getting the best possible scans out of this thing. I'll go over the Epson scan software in depth for scanning both black and white and color film. Then in another video, I'll show you my methods for inverting and editing the negatives into a final image. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that. I'm not going to talk about how I mount my film in the scanner or anything like that. All of that info is in my previous video about getting the best results from a flatbed scan. I will also not be talking about how to use Silverfast, vuescan, or any other third-party scanning software. Most third-party scanning software is designed to give you a nearly final image right out of the scanner without needing to do post-processing. I don't do that in my workflow. I simply use the scanning software to capture the negative. I then invert that negative in other software to get what is equivalent to an unedited RAW, which I then just edit like any other photo in my editing pipeline. I will mention epsonscan 2, which is just a newer version of the epsonscan software with the UI changed up a little bit. I've seen people claim epsonscan 2 scans faster, but I've tested it and I get the exact same results, at least with my V550. Also, epsonscan 1 might be slower on Apple computers compared to Windows, so in my opinion, use epsonscan 2 if you're on a Mac, and use either on Windows. I'll be using epsonscan 1 for this video. Just know if you're using epsonscan 2, all of the settings are there, they just might be named something slightly differently or are under different menus. When you go to launch the epsonscan software, if it complains about not being able to communicate with the scanner, typically just close it out and try again in a few seconds, and it should work. Maybe try launching it as admin. If that doesn't work, make sure your scanner is actually turned on. Mine has a button hidden on the right side. Also, check your cables. When I first got my scanner, it wouldn't work because I was using a bad USB extension cable, which I had already ran under the floor before testing if it worked. So once you have epsonscan running, you need to be in professional mode, no matter what. Ignore the other modes completely, they shouldn't exist. Next, you need to be in film mode. This will enable the transparency unit. Make sure you watch my previous video about flatbed scanners, because I go over how some of the higher end Epsons use a different setting here that massively impacts your film placement and scanning quality. Before I go into the other settings here, I'm going to cover how to use the preview window and make scans. First of all, press the big preview button. This is going to open up the preview window and start a low-resolution preview scan. After that, if a message pops up saying it can't find a document, just close it out. At the top left of the window, you need to be in the normal mode. This is going to show you the entire scannable area. If you're using an Epson film holder, then you can use either mode. You can use these two green arrows to rotate the entire area around so you can see the images better. This will also determine the orientation of the images when they're saved. Here I have a vertical image. I'll have to rotate that later on after I do my scans. In my flatbed scanning techniques video, I show how I prefer to scan with the film emulsion facing down. This means all of my images are going to be flipped. epsonscan 2 actually has an option to automatically flip the output images, but sadly that option isn't available in the original epsonscan software. This means I have to remember to flip the images later on. Now click on the preview and drag a square around one of the images you want to scan. If you click the zoom button at the top right, the scanner will do another preview zoom and will zoom in on the area you have selected. This can be good for people with smaller screens who can't see their selection very well. Personally, I can get all of my photos selected without needing to use the zoom at all, but I'm still covering it in case you need to use the zoom feature. When you're zoomed in, the zoom button becomes the full button. Clicking it lets you zoom back out. Now, as long as you didn't adjust your selection at all whatsoever, pressing zoom again will bring you back into your zoom instantly. However, if you adjusted your selection even just a tiny bit, when you press zoom again, it's going to do another zoom preview scan. You can also only have one zoom scan active at a time. So when you have multiple squares drawn, it has to do another zoom scan every time you want to zoom in on another area. As you can see, this is extremely annoying and very time consuming, and is why I almost never use the zoom feature. One trick you can do though, is zooming in on your entire scan area to get just a bit closer than the full view. Go back to full mode, and now you can select the sides of your selection and drag them out any direction you want. I'll drag my selection to cover the entire film strip, and now when I press zoom, it's going to give me a much larger image I can work with. With this large area selected, you can delete it just by pressing delete on your keyboard or by clicking this eraser button. Now you can start actually selecting your photos. A lot of people complain that epsonscan is tedious to set up, but really they just don't know how to use the software. These square selections are the areas that the scanner will scan. Each area will be a different file, and you can make as many as you want, but you shouldn't do it like this. There's a much better way. These squares not only contain your selection area, but also your settings for the selected area. To demonstrate, let me just turn all of these settings on. Now when I draw another square, it starts me out fresh, completely forgetting all of my settings I spent entire seconds selecting. This is why you should use the copy tool instead of just drawing new selections. Just select one of your good selections that has all of your settings already set up, and press the copy button. Now you can drag this new selection over to another area that you want to scan, and it will be the same size and have all of the same settings. You can even adjust it as you like, and then copy it again. Just keep doing this till you have all of your frames set up the way you want. If my film is straight enough and the image is interesting, I like to scan the film with the sprocket holes and the film text. Most negative conversion software requires that you have a little bit of the film border in the scan for it to do a proper inversion. However, this same software, most of the time, doesn't like it when you have the sprocket holes in the image. For example, my version of Negative Lab Pro just doesn't work when the image has these sprocket holes, but luckily, because it's a Lightroom plugin, I can crop them out, run Negative Lab Pro to invert the negative, and then in Lightroom revert the crop to the original, thus maintaining my sprocket holes while still correctly inverting the negative. I would recommend always including at least the film borders on the sides of the frame, and it's completely okay if your scan selections overlap each other. So now you know how to actually set up the areas that you want to scan properly. If you press scan now, the software is only going to scan the one image you have selected. Instead, press this all button, which will select all of your selections, then press the scan button. This is how you batch scan with the software. I'm not going to do that because now it's time I explain the other more advanced settings of the software. First of all, the file save settings, which you can access by pressing this little folder button next to the scan button. At the top, you can click Browse and select the folder you want your scans to be saved in. Below is the naming system. I've probably scanned less than 200 of my own photos. The rest have been test scans in order to perfect my method and to make this video. So hopefully I'm saving you at least 100 practice scans with this video. Now the image format, this should always be on TIFF, not multi-TIFF. Multi-TIFF is kind of like a PDF where each scan is a different page in the TIFF file. That might be good for documents, but not for photos, so set it on TIFF and press Options. The byte order doesn't really matter, but you should probably set it to Windows for general software compatibility. Under compression, select None for both unless you want to wait even longer for your scans to finish and get lower quality files. Embed ICC profile is complicated. You shouldn't need it if you're following this video, but if you do need it, then you'll know that you need it. So for the last settings here, you don't want to overwrite anything. I like to have this box pop up every scan just so I can confirm where my images are being saved, and that TIFF didn't magically get deselected, but you do what you want. I also like to have it open the folder after each batch, but when you're doing tons of scans, this can get annoying. And you of course don't want the Add Page dialog. That's it for file saving settings. You can hit OK to close. So now it's time to get into the real meat of the video, the settings you should use. I'm first going to talk about scanning color negatives because it's much more complicated than black and white, but I'll cover black and white later in the video. To begin, press the configuration button at the bottom. In the preview tab, nothing matters here. In the film size tab again, nothing matters. In the other tab, make sure save settings is checked, and for work area, select whatever drive you care about the least. I don't use correct document SKU because I haven't actually been able to test it, so it might do an okay job, but I don't know. Now in the color tab, this is the stuff that is actually important. Most people say to use color control, however, for color images, I found I get better results using ICM mode, and really they're both pretty similar. ICM mode takes the color profile of the scanner and matches it with the target color profile. In this case, you want to have the source be the Epson standard and the target be sRGB. Your monitor by default should be sRGB anyway, but if you have some kind of super crazy special monitor with an obscure profile, then maybe you want to use that, and if that's the case, you're going to want to embed your ICC profile in the TIFFs too. But sRGB is the universal standard, so you shouldn't worry about it. Also, you could actually buy a color chart, scan it, and then use that to build a custom source profile for your scanner. So that's something to consider if you want to get really crazy accurate colors. With sRGB, the gamma should be 2.2, which is the gamma that my version of Negative Lab Pro works with, so I don't have to run the TIFF prep on my files. But other software gives different results. For example, grain to pixel doesn't always give good results with files straight from the ICM mode, but it works amazingly with the no color correction mode. I believe this is because Epson adds extra saturation to scans in ICM and color control mode. Some people have found setting the saturation to -27 gives you a flatter image, just like in no color correction mode, but I'll talk about that a little later. So you might want to experiment with the no color correction mode, or if your software doesn't like the ICM files, then try to desaturate them or lower the contrast a little bit depending on your inversion workflow. The big problem when using the no color correction option is that it doesn't allow you to use digital ice, which for color film you really do want. I've tested heavily both methods. Both require different post-processing techniques for the scan, and sometimes I do feel like I get better results with the no color correction scans, but the difference might just be psychological. This whole choice is mostly up to your artistic interpretation and your inversion methodology. I'd do some scans with both modes just to check out what you like, but I'll continue on assuming you've chosen ICM mode. Now you may notice for this entire beginning demonstration, my film type has been set to color negative film. This was just so I could explain how I'm not going to be using this mode. Yes, you can use this mode and let Epson invert your negative for you, and it probably does an okay job, but personally, I don't think it's nearly as good as what I can get by doing it myself or with other inversion software. So I'll be setting this to positive film mode. This is going to delete your preview image too, so just hit OK and do another preview. Below this, there's the image type. This determines the color quality of your output file. There's a lot of options here, but since we're scanning color, we want 48-bit. This will give you proper 16-bit TIFF files, that being 16 bits per color channel, which of course adds up to 48 bits. Now there's resolution. Quite a decisive topic. You'll see many people online claiming that flatbed scanners only have an effective resolution of X. I talk a bit about this in my flatbed guide video, but basically it's all BS. Yes, flatbeds are limited optically to the detail they can resolve, but each flatbed scanner is unique and might be able to resolve details better than another one. A lot of problems with flatbeds come from people not knowing how to focus the film and not knowing how to sharpage the image in post, which I'll discuss in the next video. Furthermore, I've done extensive testing, and I've found when scanning 35mm film in color, lowering the DPI has a negligible impact on scanning times. For black and white, it seems you gain a tiny bit of speed, but it still isn't really that much of a difference. Scanning black and white or color at 4800 DPI takes a little over 1.5 minutes per photo, and less if you're doing batch scans since the scanner doesn't have to do its little start-up dance every single time. When you enable digital ice with color film, that time doubles to a little over 3 minutes per image in batch mode. So digital ice doubles your scan time. Digital ice also works better at higher DPIs. When you drop down to 3200 DPI for color, the scan time remains the same. Maybe going even lower might speed it up more, but I'll show you why you wouldn't want to do that in just a moment. Another reason you want to scan at a high DPI is so you can slightly rotate your image later without getting artifacts from the image resampling. In general, you want the scan to be as high DPI as the scanner will allow you, but the advertised max optical resolution of all Epson Perfection scanners is only 6400 DPI. These other values above 6400 are interpolated values, meaning the software is just upscaling the image. I don't think it's actually doing anything different physically from a scan at 6400 DPI, so you probably never want to go above 6400. Look at this image. This is a scan at 6400 DPI. Notice the color fringing? Now here's that same image, but this scan was made at 4800 DPI, and you can see there's significantly less color fringing. So my max scan resolution is 4800 DPI, but make sure you test this on your own scanner because again, every scanner is unique. Here's 4800 DPI, and now here's 3200 DPI. Now I know what you're immediately thinking. Whoa, 3200 looks so much sharper and detailed. You're wrong. The reason it looks more sharp and more detailed is because I've zoomed in on the scan. You're actually seeing the grid of pixels with their sharp edges. These edges are tricking your brain into thinking there's more detail than there really is. This is called the perception of sharpness. But yeah, you can clearly see the 3200 DPI scan has noticeable pixels, and that means the color gradations are not going to be as smooth. Even if the scanner isn't resolving details at the set resolution, you still need enough pixels to get those details that are resolved to be smooth enough where you can come in later and sharpen them up, which will give you a far better result than the 3200 DPI scan when sharpened. Now I'll admit I do scan stuff at 3200 sometimes if it's just like a set of photos I don't care about. You know, stuff like old family vacation photos or stuff that I'm not really going to do much post-processing on beyond the inversion. Again, the DPI change causes minimal scanning time increase, so for me, there isn't a reason not to scan at 4800. 6400 is harder to sharpen too, since the details are made of way too many pixels. And as I've shown, my scanner can't do 6400 without color fringing. So there it is, the final solution to the DPI question. For me anyway. We can finally move on to the other settings in the Epson Scan software and wrap up the video. So you can see there's 5 buttons. One is grayed out, and below that there are special options. If your window isn't big enough, you might have to scroll down to see all of them. This one on the left with the ball is the auto expose button. You pretty much never want to use this. The one to the right of this is the important one. This is the histogram adjustment. By default, these will probably be your settings. Notice the input and output values are clamped a little bit. To get a truly flat scan, you need to manually unclamp these like so. Drag your blacks to 0 and your whites to 255. Leave the middle at 1. Now do the same thing for the output. Bring the black to 0 and the white to 255. Don't get me started on limited versus full RGB. You want to make sure you're using the full output range or you're going to get banding, so make sure you always have your output set like this. Now the input on the other hand is technically subjective. In theory, it's possible that clamping your input slightly will actually give you better dynamic range or smooth the tones of the image on the output. But for my testing, I haven't really found that to always be the case. I get very similar results after doing an inversion regardless of input clamping or no input clamping. So I usually like to leave the input totally unclamped, but if you're dealing with photos with extreme shadows or highlights, you might want to adjust these. This might be especially true for slide film since it has a lot less latitude than normal color negative film or black and white film. If you do decide to mess with this, I would say try not to clip anything unless you know what you're doing. Even though right now it looks like I'm totally good and not clipping, when I go to the red channel, look at that, the reds are clipping. The Epson Scan software isn't really that great in this regard, so if you clamp your input, clamp it less than you think it should be, and then check each channel to be safe. Below the input and output values, you'll have the contrast curve. Set both of these to normal. You'll notice up here there's little shortcuts to the other 2 tools that are over in the main panel. These are tone correction and image adjustment. For image adjustment, I keep everything on 0. Some people say that lowering your contrast, or lowering saturation, will give you a better result sometimes, but really I found it doesn't make much difference for my workflow, though I know for sure that Epson Scan is giving me more saturation than it would in non-color corrected mode. I've read -27 is a good setting for saturation if you want something closer to no color correction mode. The tone correction window is very important, but only has one setting you need to worry about. Make sure the tone curve is set to linear. That's it. You don't want Epson Scan messing with your curve. Having an unclamped input, output, and a linear tone curve will give you the closest thing to an untouched negative that you can get, while still having the ability to use digital ice and other effects. Not that you would want to use them after I explain what they do. Because I'm scanning my negatives in positive film mode, some of these extra options might not function the way Epson intends them to work. Backlight correction and color restoration both do pretty much the same thing. Mess with your settings. Check it out. If I enable color restoration, then go back and look at my histogram, my tones, and my image adjustment, you'll see everything is totally messed up now. This feature works a bit better when you're actually scanning in negative mode, but when you're doing what I'm doing, it's totally busted. Backlight correction does the same exact thing, it just messes with your settings in the same way, this time to a lesser extent. You want to avoid these 2 settings completely if you want the best possible scans. Next is the grain reduction feature. This should be renamed to the Blur My Scan button, because that's all it does, it just blurs the entire image. Never enable it. The same goes for the dust removal feature. This should be renamed to the Ruin My Scan button because it does just that. Never enable this one. That leaves us with Unsharp Mask and Digital Ice. Unsharp Mask is an interesting one because it looks good at first glance, but if you actually know how to properly sharpen an image, then you'll know that you can do a better job manually. Here's an image direct from the scanner with Unsharp Mask off. Now here's another scan of it, but with Unsharp Mask on high. Again, you're probably thinking, whoa, it looks so good. But check this out. This is the first scan, but after I've sharpened it myself. I'm toggling it on and off here, and I doubt you can tell any difference, but let me zoom in for you. Here's the original, here's Unsharp Mask on high, and here's my sharpened original. As you can see, not only has mine brought out more detail, but it has also produced far less image artifacts and haloing. Look at another part of the image. Here's the original, Epson sharpening, and now mine. Again, mine is clearly better. I'll show you how to sharpen this way in the next video where I go over my entire negative inversion and post-processing pipeline. I would recommend leaving unsharp mask off, but if you're scanning something that you don't care about at all, or you don't plan on editing the photo that much, then maybe consider putting it on low or medium. The final setting, Digital Ice, is really the only setting you should ever use, and you should probably have it enabled at all times. This makes your scanner scan the image twice, but the second pass is done in infrared, which allows the scanner to detect all of the little specks of dust, and it automatically removes them for you. Now this is far from perfect, as any large pieces of debris on your negative will still show up even with Digital Ice. It tries to remove it, but you're still going to see it, and you're going to have to manually fix these yourself. But for the most part, Digital Ice does a pretty damn good job. There are some fringe cases where Digital Ice can mess up a color negative, like in this example I've found, but I have personally never had this happen to me. Look at this image without Digital Ice, and here it is with Digital Ice. This is pretty much required when scanning color negatives, but if you can deal with the dust via some other method like wet mounting or whatever, then you might not need it at all. And if that's the case, I'd recommend scanning in the no color correction mode, which is what I'm going to switch to right now, because now I'm going to be talking about scanning black and white film. I've tried scanning black and white on both ICM and no color correction mode, and I pretty much always have better results on no color correction mode. Now you may be thinking, what about input clamping, and what about Digital Ice? I can't use it now. Well, you can't use Digital Ice on black and white anyway, because it just doesn't work. I mean, you can try it, but it's going to give you these super dark ink blot looking artifacts that will ruin your image. Though maybe you want to ruin your image for artistic purposes, so go right ahead. The real secret is, dust on black and white film is far less noticeable than dust on color film. You will of course still have to do some manual touch-up to get rid of the big noticeable bits, but for the most part, the dust just kind of looks like grain. So when you're scanning black and white in no color correction mode, the only setting you gotta worry about is changing your image type from 48-bit color to 16-bit grayscale. You may see people online claim that you should still scan in 48-bit color and then manually extract the red or the green or the blue channel for the best results, but that's all BS. I've tested that method one-to-one with scanning in just 16-bit grayscale, and not only is it super tedious, but it also produces results that are completely identical, if not slightly worse when I pixel peep. So just put it on 16-bit grayscale and you're good to go. Don't bother changing anything else. You still want to be on positive film mode too. Don't change it to black and white mode, though doing so might not be that big of a deal. When you're in no color correction mode, you don't have to worry about fixing the input and output clamping or the tone curve, because none of that stuff matters, nor can you access it. So that's pretty much it. That's my process to scan film with the Epson Scan software. I hope this video was helpful. I originally intended to include the entire negative inversion and post-processing process in this video, but this one is way too long already, and I figure this one will be helpful just as a standalone guide for just the Epson Scan software in general. I'll go over all of the image inversion and processing stuff in the next video in this series, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that. And go follow me on Instagram too, @shystudios.us if you want to see my cool photos.